Hi everyone. This week we spoke to Sebene Selassie. Sebene is a meditation teacher, author and speaker. She's also a 3-time cancer survivor, and her work focuses on the areas of belonging and identity. Our conversation looked at her journey into meditation and her work in unconscious biases, amongst much more. As ever, if you enjoyed the episode, please give us a rating and a review on iTunes. Hi Sebene, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Harry?
Yeah, I'm not too bad, thank you. To start with, we always ask about what people's kind of relationship to mental health is, but I think it might be more useful for you to kind of give an overview of who you are, what you do, and all that kind of stuff, if you can do that fairly concisely.
Sure, yeah. My name's Sebene Selassie, and I am a meditation teacher and an author, and I teach both in a Buddhist tradition and the Insight tradition, and I also teach secular mindfulness meditation, and I do that in a variety of ways, pre-pandemic, teaching silent retreats and workshops and things live, and currently doing a lot of things online.
I suppose the first question would be, how did you kind of come to meditation? How did you find it, and what sparked your interest in it?
I'm really lucky that I kind of happened upon Eastern thought very young. So when I was a teenager, actually, my brother became what's colloquially known as a Hare Krishna. And I'm almost 50 now, so this is a long time ago. And I started going to kirtan and going to lectures and reading the Bhagavad Gita and all these different texts. By the time I got to my first year of university, I decided that I wanted to be a religious studies major. And I left kind of that tradition behind and became much more interested in Buddhism. And when I got out of university, I actually finally started meditating in my early 20s. In my mid-20s, I found a Zen teacher that I practiced with for a number of years. And then over the years, practiced in different traditions, traveled through Southeast Asia, practiced in Thailand for a few months, and now I've been kind of firmly planted in the Insight tradition, which comes from Theravadan Buddhism, which is the Buddhism you find in Southeast Asia, and have been teaching mindfulness as well for about a decade.
Why was it that when you were studying it, you didn't really practice? Was it just a time management thing, or just
back then and to some extent now, there was sort of a hesitation among scholars of religious studies and particularly of Buddhism to mix the intellectual academic study and practice. So there was even sort of the assumption that your objectivity would be watered down if you actually practiced. So there were a lot of closet practitioners, actually, including some of my professors. And I kind of just sort of unknowingly or unwittingly absorbed that divorce of practice and study, and kind of had to reintegrate that back in as I ventured on in my own practice.
That's really interesting. I think I can draw maybe not that similar parallel, but in climate change in particular, there's quite a big gap between, and I'm like incredibly guilty of it myself, of knowing exactly what's going on and knowing the things you can do to protect the earth, but not really doing it. So we had a meeting the other day, and it was in the sustainability group of our department, and I think we worked out, I can't remember the exact number, I think we worked it out that our carbon footprint, the average person in our group, our carbon footprint was, I think it was either 5 or 500, which is quite a big difference, but it was one of those higher than the national average, which is pretty shocking. So I can see that gap between kind of knowledge and practice in academia might not just be in the area that you studied in.
Yeah, it's kind of that myth of objectivity that permeates maybe science and social sciences as well.
Yeah, definitely. So what were the kind of, once you started meditating in a more serious way, what were the kind of benefits you saw from it, and what kept you coming back to it?
In my experience, both my personal experience and what I see in students that I've encountered, most often we come to meditation because of some kind of suffering or pain. So, except for maybe a few people who have a natural inclination towards meditation and sort of just fall into it, or maybe have been raised in an environment that really encourages it, most of us turn to it as a tool for something to help us with something. For me, at that age, in my early mid-20s, it was mostly around heartache and heartbreak, and just general confusion and unhappiness in my life. So I turned to it, in a moment of a lot of pain. I actually went and found the teacher that I found that I ended up working with for many years, in a moment of heartbreak after a breakup. And I found that it was not easy at all, because what meditation, particularly mindfulness, asks us to do is to really open to our experience. We're usually trying to run away from pain and run away from difficulties. And mindfulness is teaching us to build a capacity to stay with our experience, whatever it might be. And it teaches us to create kind of more space and more allowing of whatever's happening. And the paradox is that allowing actually invites transformation. So the pain doesn't necessarily go away, but we develop a capacity of being with it with more ease. So that's really what I experienced. And it's not that suddenly all of my pain went away. This is a process. And so what I found is that every time I meditated, I could kind of open up to the heartbreak I was feeling. And then the next week, it would be the same process. And over time, that created more spaciousness and capacity.
Yeah, I think we were talking before about my kind of use of meditation with chronic pain, and that is that notion of kind of focusing on it without really. So when it's bad, when my flare-ups are bad, I kind of tend to focus on it, and that focus is saying, looking out for it and being like, oh god, this is happening again, tightening it up and associating it with a bad thing. But when I find mindfulness most helpful is when I can kind of look at it in a more look at it at more of a distance and see what's actually going on, rather than what I expect to be going on. And that means that I don't kind of tense in around the pain. And I think in a few books that I've read, it talks about secondary suffering. So it removes that kind of secondary suffering away from the first pain. But I don't know if I've kind of butchered that explanation completely.
Oh, it's a beautiful explanation. I really appreciate your insight into kind of the tightening or tensing. You use both of those words, and that really resonates for me, because it is a type of clinging, whether we're trying to hold on to a good experience or we're forcing something we consider bad away. There is that tightening and tension, and that's actually the extra suffering that we bring to pain. So one of the kind of modern mindfulness equations is pain times resistance equals suffering.
Yeah.
So, we can't get rid of pain. That's the nature of life, but we can sort of soften so that we don't have that extra resistance that leads to more pain, or what we could call suffering.
Yeah, definitely. And something I've read that or listened to you talk about is how you used how meditation helped you during your treatment for cancer. And if you wouldn't mind talking about that a bit, how did you use meditation during that time, and how did it complement I suppose more Western medical practices, more traditional practices, and why was it particularly helpful for you during that time?
Yeah, so I unfortunately have had cancer 3 times. I had I was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer when I was 34, and then had 2 more subsequent diagnoses of stage 4 cancer. And I luckily was a meditator already for about a decade when I was first diagnosed, so was able to really bring these practices into my experience of cancer, and particularly my experience of treatment, which involved a lot of discomfort and pain, both emotional and mental, as well as physical. So, I did a lot of what you just described really well. In a moment of pain, of um, really caustic chemotherapy treatment, or post surgery in a hospital or at home, um, recognizing the pain and not kind of attaching more suffering to it by trying to push it away, by going into stories of woe is me, or is this going to get worse, or how can I make this instantly go away or be better. And that relaxation, so not going into that tension or tightness around what's happening, again, either emotionally or physically, but actually bringing some relaxed, open, spacious awareness to it, uh, just allowed me to have ease in relationship to what was happening. So practicing over and over again that I couldn't get rid of the pain of being sick or fearing for my life, but I could have a relationship of more kindness, and more clear seeing about exactly what was happening in that particular moment.
Did it kind of help? I don't know if this was your experience at all, but when you kind of got re-diagnosed the second time, did it help you with a feeling of maybe anger that had happened, or frustration?
Yeah. And again, there's something paradoxical about practice, about mindfulness practice, because it's not that it helped with those feelings because I made them instantly go away, or didn't have them. It actually allowed me to feel them more, in a sense.
Mm.
It's because we often experience a bad feeling, whether that feeling is mental, emotional, or physical, and we think it's a mistake, we think it's a problem, and we usually think it needs to go away. Or we grasp for what we consider to be good feelings. And so instead, those feelings of fear or frustration, or even rage at being diagnosed so young, and again, I could actually allow myself to feel the heartbreak or the upset, and again create more space around those feelings, so that I didn't need them to go away, but I also didn't need them to kind of rule me, or to get completely lost in them.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions of mindfulness, and definitely one that I went into it with, is that um, the issues that I was using it for, or started using it for, were like the pain, and my association or my expectation was that I'll do this once and I need to see the benefit of it straight away, and I need to be in less pain having done it than I was in before. But that's not really how it works. And you were kind of talking about it there, that it's a, well, first of all, it's like a longer term process, and there's a reason why I suppose it's called practice, but also that there's a misconception that it will help you get rid of these things. But from what you were just saying, it's not that. It's more learning to live with them and understand them a bit better.
Yeah, to really be able to see things more clearly. So to see that you might have habitual reactions to things. And so to understand that about ourselves, and then to really just be more kind with them, like bring that softening, that allowing, and there's a measure of self-compassion or self-kindness that's involved in that I think is a really key part of mindfulness. Sometimes we pay attention, no pun intended, to the attentional quality of mindfulness. So we think of mindfulness as kind of bringing our awareness to something, but that awareness has this really profound quality of kindness to it as well. So we can kind of play this sly game of, okay, if I allow it, then it'll go away. And so we can kind of get into this game of mindfulness of, oh, if I just bring awareness to it, then it'll soften or get a little easier. And that needs our kind attention as well, just to see how we're, constantly trying to run away from what we're feeling and try and manipulate our experience. So mindfulness sometimes can be described more as like an attitude, this capacity to really just accept the humanness of our reality, that none of us will get through life without experiencing some form of illness, some forms of pain, on various levels, and to really be gentle with ourselves in that process.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And something that I've seen you or heard you talk about is how a lot of meditation, the classes around meditation and the kind of setup of it is a very kind of, especially in the States, and I think it's just as true here in the UK, is a very white kind of middle class dominated environment. And I was wondering, first of all, why do you think that is, and is it up to the people that are there that to create a more inclusive environment, and the people in the class to create a more inclusive environment?
I think it's a very complex investigation, also because we live in a complex society, in places like the UK or the US, where we have more kind of multicultural dynamics going on. So the reason why it's that way largely is because of the people who traveled to Asia mostly in the 60s and 70s, although, a lot of translations of Buddhist texts and Eastern teachings happened much earlier, which also opens up like the colonial project of the introduction of Hinduism and Buddhism to the West. But let's just kind of attend to kind of the rise of mindfulness here is due to basically all these white young people going to India and Southeast Asia in the 60s and 70s and studying with all these great Asian masters. And when coming back, kind of filtering it through their lens, which was predominantly white, middle and upper middle class, because that's what these people were. And so that even the translation of the teachings came through particular voices. So some of the cultural background of these teachings got lost in the way. And that was somewhat intentional, particularly with mindfulness. There was a desire to create kind of a secular version of these teachings so that it could be introduced into hospitals and settings where people weren't going to be open to the cultural reality of these teachings and where they came from. But in doing that, they also erased something, kind of erased the origins. And the intentions were good in the sense that they wanted these teachings to have a wider reach. But in that, kind of erase the origins of this coming from particular communities and people, particularly from people of color. And then simultaneously, of course, you have heritage Buddhist communities that are doing these meditation practices in their temples or wats or centers. So it's this kind of strange dynamic happening where these teachings are being translated in one way over here and experienced in another way in communities. So then you have a modern mindfulness movement that is inherently very white in its composition of who is teaching it, but also in its expression of how it's being taught. So I think that there are some people of color who are still able to receive those teachings, even though they might be the only ones in the room. And there is a lot of tension, as there is in many settings, in universities and schools and in workplaces, around kind of the cultural dominance of whiteness and dominant culture and how it's expressed in general. So there are movements to have more teachers of color, which I think is probably kind of the best way for students of color to hear these teachings expressed in a different way, to have a reflection at the front of the room, because there are just general power dynamics that happen otherwise. And that's a complex project in itself, to make sure that there is a diversity of voices kind of expressing these teachings and paying attention to the history of how these teachings originated and how they've been translated and how we got here in the first
And
place.
is there also, I suppose, a kind of issue of accessibility in that?
Yeah, for sure. And that is also being paid attention to as well. And I'm not sure how it is in the UK, but in the US, there's been more and more attention, both in Buddhist spaces, but also in secular mindfulness spaces, to scholarships, to accessibility, to the training of teachers and organizations themselves around these issues of inclusivity and equity, but also to making sure that there are spaces available, and then again, that then there isn't harm done to those people when they're brought into spaces and the teachings are, presented in a particular way. Again, so training teachers of color and leaders of color is an important part of that process too.
Yeah, and something that I've heard you talk about um, the kind of unconscious biases, particularly towards race, and how that quite often, again, I might be not explaining this particularly well, but how quite often we can use mindfulness to kind of acknowledge that everyone has these, but that it's much harder to translate that into action. So I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more about that and perhaps explain it a bit better than I did.
Well, there's such a surge right now in awareness around the construct of race and how it's inherently tied into racism, and particularly the roots of it being in anti-Blackness, and how that permeates out through the colonial project and through the history of slavery in general. So we have all been affected by those hundreds of years of historical programming that way. And one thing that mindfulness really teaches us is to start to begin to see our own programming and our own habits of mind. And so there's an interest right now in unconscious bias and seeing how these biases play out in very harmful ways, obviously through the Black Lives Matter movement. We're seeing, particularly right now, the surge in attention around police brutality and police killings. And so mindfulness, of course, we can become more clear about conscious racism and people who hold those values, but most of us have conscious egalitarian values and goals, but we're really ruled by the unconscious. And the unconscious doesn't change through our conscious wishes, but through a real attention to these patterns and habits of mind that can only really be seen if we have this capacity trained. So for me, this moment that we are living right now of attention to these deep-seated issues are only really changeable through a practice like mindfulness. And mindfulness is just a particular term for bringing awareness to this deep patterning. But for me, it's really been the best tool And I don't see how we can do work around unconscious bias without mindfulness, because again, the most important part of that phrase is unconscious. Like, these are implicit uh, habit patterns. They're conditioned into us because our society is steeped in them and has been for a long time. And to undo them, we need to kind of go below the layer of I want to be a good person, to really starting to pay attention to the ways we react to different people, to different situations, to different information, what we pay attention to, what we don't pay attention to. And we can do that, um, not only in our personal lives. And so, we've both experienced how much this practice can help us with our own physical pain or our own emotional pain, but it can also help us in relationship and in society.
So when you start to acknowledge those unconscious biases that you have, is it, I think a lot of people will think that, that they are a good person, they believe in equality, and that actually it might be a bit uncomfortable for them, like anyone, because everyone has these unconscious biases, that it might be a bit uncomfortable for them to explore those. And how would it translate from people starting to explore them um, to turning into, I suppose, more active intentions and actions?
Yeah, so the we can take conscious actions to create change in the world, and it's not that we don't do that, but what this practice does with unconscious biases and unconscious patterns is allows us to bring the same practice of clarity and kindness, bringing awareness and allowing, and again to allow that practice to in, open us to that paradoxical transformation. So it's just like with physical pain. When I see kind of a bias arise in me as and I can admit to this myself, the tension I might feel walking down a dark street and a young Black kid starts walking towards me. So rather than push that away, I can actually notice, oh, look at me, falling into the bias and stereotypes that are prevalent and assuming something about this young guy I don't know. So it's not by pushing it away, but by allowing it and bringing some kind of just kind investigation to it. Often when we experience something we don't like, whether it's physical pain or seeing bias, we want to push it away. We want to change it. We want to make it better. But it has a lighter touch to it, mindfulness, and it allows for these sort of gentle stereotype replacements. And one of the things I used to say to myself when I would notice that kind of thought pattern arising is like, I don't know, he could be a Rhodes Scholar for all I know. And that in technical terms, that's called stereotype replacement. But it's a really gentle way to just start to question and undo patterning that has just become so habitual.
Yeah, there was we I spoke to a doctor last week, and he was saying he works in psychiatry. He's a graduate from Harvard, but he's also a 6'6", very well built Black guy, and that the differences in how people react to him when he's wearing his kind of name badge which says doctor, and when he's maybe in his more casual stuff going to the shop or something is kind of huge. So I kind of building on that. How has everything that's going on in America, whether it be uh, the coronavirus and also the kind of exposure of police brutality and the marches, how has that been for you mentally, I suppose, and also has it changed your practice at all, or have you found ways uh, to look at those things through your practice?
Well, at this point, it's hard for me to not to, I look at everything through my practice. But there's been so much going on here. You know, I live in Brooklyn, which is a hot spot. And so I was just saying to someone yesterday, you know, we went from hearing ambulances night and day to then hearing police sirens and helicopters all through the night, to now there's a phenomena of fireworks happening. I think that it's, you know, young people in the neighborhood being sold fireworks that couldn't be sold otherwise, and also given fireworks by who knows who. Um, and so there's just been a lot of noise and a lot of activation. And I noticed that in myself, that I've had to really up my practice and my attention to kind of using the practice to help calm and regulate my system, because there's so much uncertainty. There's so much tension just around in terms of people having a lot of fear and anxiety. And particularly around just kind of the race awareness that's growing and the consciousness that's shifting in this country. It's also quite intense. I luckily live in a place, I live in a Black neighborhood, and I live in a very diverse city. So I don't necessarily feel the backlash of what might be happening in other parts of the country. I actually feel this surge of excitement and hopefulness around me. So that's really exciting. And I also, you know, I'm concerned about a backlash, either politically or culturally in this country. And I know that's part of the process. You know, change often doesn't come easily, especially from dominant systems of power. But I am encouraged by people's awareness and attention to it. My hope is that particularly white people who are being awakened right now, and non-Black people of color who are awakening to the, you know, perniciousness and power of anti-Black racism, that attention doesn't wane before we can really start to make you know, strong headway in systemic change. But you know, we need the inner change. We need people to recognize what's going on in themselves in order to have a real powerful systemic change.
Yeah, that has kind of raised quite an interesting, well, and you might not find it interesting, but an interesting thought for me, that how do you balance the desire for change and the striving for change, um, and the frustration that maybe things aren't happening quick enough? There's a perception of mindfulness that it makes you become passive, or that, you know, you become dispassionate about certain issues. So what would you say to people that say that, or that get very frustrated by the slow pace of change, and how can mindfulness be incorporated in that, I guess?
You know, I think there can be some truth to, it's not necessarily about the dispassion, but it's there there is a tendency among many uh, Western mindfulness practitioners to make this only kind of an internal process. So I find the dispassion or the lack of attention to the outer world, when we only use our practice to focus in on our personal improvement project, let's say, you know, can lead us to disconnect from what's happening around us. But I think true mindfulness, and this is even in the classical teachings, is both internal and external. And it says, and both internal and external. So we build this capacity not only for self-awareness, but for awareness of what's going on around us, and for seeing kind of the interconnection between the two. So I really believe that the clarity and kindness, sometimes referred to as wisdom and compassion, and that capacity to see clearly what's going on within us and around us, and to bring more kindness and compassion to it. I think that's such a powerful tool for change. And part of that clarity and wisdom is just seeing the long arc of history, all the causes and conditions, to use Buddhist term, like all the karma, which is really complex. Many forces and many different happenings led to this moment. And so to think that it'll change just because I've changed or just because I want things to change, really doesn't do justice to the amount of factors involved. If we're talking about racism, economic, health, environmental, social, political, there are a lot of systems, a lot of forces, a lot of organizations, a lot of corporations, a lot of people that are involved in making change happen. So just trusting that if we keep moving forward and gather more momentum, that change will come regardless. I mean, that's true. Now, whether that's change we want or not, that's our role to play.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. And to finish, we always ask how you personally look after your mental health. But I suppose a more pertinent question would be, what does your practice look like at the moment? Is it kind of slightly more informal, or is it more structured?
It's both. I do a formal practice every morning. My husband and I practice together, and that's been really important. I'm a big proponent of laying down meditation,
Yeah, I
which
think sorry, I definitely, I think for me, I agree with that, because kind of sitting straight and upright is, it kind of causes me to get a bit stiff and sore. But I'd be interesting to know why why you think lying down practice is good.
I think it's good because, in my experience, most Westerners, their problem is not being too relaxed. That most of us are wound up, and particularly at this moment, there is so much vigilance, and you described it well as tightness and tension in our bodies and minds. And we can bring that same quality to our practice, especially when we feel like we have to sit up straight and, we have some idea of a full lotus position floating somewhere off the ground as like the height of true meditation practice. And that real letting go and relaxation that I think is what a lot of us in this kind of modernized cultures need is really supported by allowing yourself to release into the ground. And we can actually experience the physical reality of what we are aspiring to in our minds and hearts, which is this real letting go of this need to get somewhere, this need to change or fix, so that we're more available in our lives from this really balanced place. We're often entering into our workday, our time with our children or in the world, from this tension, like I need to do this and I need to do that, and why and I didn't do this, or and we kind of ricochet between overactivity and collapse. Then we completely sort of vegetate out in front of a Netflix marathon, and we just sort of ricochet back and forth between being super overactive and then collapse, super overactive and collapse. And we're really trying to find that balance where we're available for moving forward or for moving away from something, but not in this kind of ricochet way, but a real clear understanding of what it is we want to do in the world.
Yeah, that's really cool. And where can we find more about what you do, your teaching, your book, all that kind of stuff?
Oh, great. Yeah. So I have a book coming out at the end of August, all about belonging, identity, connecting to ourselves, connecting to others across difference, and really recognizing that we belong to each other. It's called You Belong. And you can find information about it and about me on my website, sebeneselassie.com, or I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Sebene Selassie.
Brilliant. That's been really interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Harry. Really nice to talk to you.
Hi everyone, I really hope you enjoyed that episode. Just a quick note to say that although the things Sebene and I talked about we may find helpful, I'm not a trained medical professional. If you're struggling with your mental health, please contact your GP or an organisation like Samaritans on 116 123.